Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It is great to have the one and the only John Gleason, Godless Engineer.
Hi, I'm so sorry I'm a little late. I was talking to my son and he sometimes it's like hit or miss. He likes to ramble on about stuff. So I was just talking to him and I let him go for as long as I could.
I totally get that. I was thinking about starting the show and letting you jump in because I always make comments at the beginning anyway, and it doesn't really matter because I always like to say hello to people in the chat. Hello to Mr. Shadow Kitty, to Mr. Um, Apetivis, to Eric Mishima, and Asexual Atheist. Thank you everyone for coming today. Today I have something just slightly different I've had John on before and I think everybody knows John, but one thing that's a little different, I usually either have an atheist with me and we kind of talk about things that I agree with, or I have a believer. Oh, here's Caitlin. And N3VR3MOR3. That's an interesting name. Okay. But this is a topic from an atheist that I don't actually agree with this position, but I am open to it and I'd be interested in learning about it. I've heard a little bit about mythicism, of course, from you and from watching some of your content and
Hmm.
watching a little bit of Richard Carrier's content. But I don't know a whole lot about it. So let's start out by introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your channel, and then tell us how you came into mythicism.
Okay, yeah, that's good. So I'm the Godless Engineer. You can find me on here on YouTube at Godless Engineer. Pretty much any other social media platform, I'm just Godless Engineer. I believe on Facebook it's Godless Engineering as the page, and then there's also a group that goes with it. So y'all can join the group if you want to, if you're on Facebook, if you care about that particular piece of social media. Um, and over on my channel, I do all sorts of different kinds of content, mostly on atheism, but also on science and where religion and science kind of intersect, and then also where history and religion intersect. That's another big part of my channel, which is where the mythicism comes in. Now, uh, I came to the mythicist position when I was actually arguing on Facebook, because that's how old I am. I was arguing in a Facebook group, and I ran across somebody who claimed that there's no evidence to suggest that Jesus even existed. And so, I mean, I was like, surely, yeah, we've got to have some kind of evidence out there that suggests that Jesus existed. I mean, that's got to be something that's well established. And so, I picked up a couple books. The first one was David Fitzgerald. His nailed 10 lies about Christianity or something like that, or 10 false things about Christianity. And basically it was kind of sort of an introductory book to the mythicist position. And it laid everything out pretty simply, and it was able to explain a lot of stuff. And so I didn't immediately label myself a mythicist right from the get-go. I sincerely tried to find good evidence that would suggest that Jesus actually existed in history. But what I found were a lot of appeals to certain sources that don't actually prove that Jesus existed in history. And I found the arguments against those sources to be far more compelling than
Mm,
arguments for those sources.
mhm.
And so, just like with my own, position on whether or not God exists, I had to just, sit down and really consider my position. And I came to the position that I just simply wasn't convinced that he existed in history. There's no single piece of evidence that I would feel comfortable enough saying, yes, this right here shows that he was a historical figure. And I mean, there are plenty of other figures in history that we could point to that have very little evidence, but I would be fine saying that they existed, like
Mhm.
Paul. Paul, I do believe, existed in whatever form. A person named Paul wrote a bunch of letters, and that has become part of the canon of Christianity. And another person that I think most likely existed was Peter, because Paul writes about Peter. Paul writes about things in a very testimonial type of way. So I think that it would take a lot of evidence to suggest that somebody named Cephas or Peter didn't exist in the first century within Christianity. But for me, the whole idea of a historical Jesus kind of falls apart when you try to find that solid historical reference that is of the same kind and quality
Hmm.
uh, as other historical figures. And I just haven't been able to find that yet. And so I'm always very interested to see if anybody has a new take on a particular source, or has any new evidence to suggest that a Jesus started like the Christian movement, or was at the center of Christianity in some kind of way. I'm always very interested in that kind of evidence. But um, so far, all of the evidence only points to a celestial version of Jesus, and not an actual earthly Jesus. So uh, I'm I'm fully open to questions, or if you have anything that really trips you up about the mythicist position, I'll do my best to answer.
I do have one major question, but I'm going to take this one from the chat first so I don't lose it.
Mhm.
And that is, but both Paul and Peter write about Jesus, so why isn't he real?
So Leophilus, he is very, very anti-mythicist, and so hopefully the chat doesn't degrade into like name calling and insults and everything. But um,
If
I
they
don't know.
do, but I've got plenty of mods that will take care of that. My mods
Right.
are great.
Well, so we don't have any writings from Peter. We
Right.
have Paul writing about Peter. There's two books in the Bible um, that that claim Peter authored them, but it wasn't actually Peter that authored them. That's actually mainstream scholarship that has that position down. And then we got Paul, who wrote about Jesus, but only the indications that we get are that he was more of a celestial figure to Paul rather than an actual earthly figure. There are
Mhm.
some vague passages in Paul, and we can get to those if people in the comments really want to ask those questions or whatnot. But all of the vague passages, for me at least, the arguments against them being a reference to a historical Jesus are far more compelling than the arguments that suggest that they are a historical reference to a Jesus. And I'm so sorry, Leophilius. I did not mean to mispronounce your name. I'm notoriously bad at pronouncing names, so
That's why
I
I
will.
just said Leo. I wasn't sure how I
Leo.
wasn't sure if it was Leophilius or Leophilius or yeah, so I just said Leo to be on the safe
Le-
side.
Leophilius. I got it.
Mm.
I think I could get it. Eventually, I'll get it.
Mm.
So,
Okay, the one major question that I would have would be the Josephus reference. And I
yeah.
certainly don't consider the Josephus reference anything supporting any kind of God claims of Jesus or any kind of resurrection claims of Jesus or anything like that. But there is a reference to the fact that a person by the name of Jesus was crucified.
Right. Which particular passage in Josephus are you talking about?
I was only aware of one that referred to a crucifixion, so that would be the one. I don't
Okay.
know Josephus well enough to cite book.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, I know which one. It's the Testimonium Flavianum, and
Okay.
that's a widely appealed to um, passage. There's also, just for your own edification, there's also another passage where it supposedly talks about Jesus's brother James.
Mhm.
And so that one doesn't talk about Jesus being crucified or anything like that, but it refers to him as the Christ. So, anyways, the there's a lot of problems with the Josephus passage, and this has been noted in like mainstream scholarship, even by biblical scholars. But so the problems are vast. For one thing, the content of it doesn't sound like Josephus in several different ways. Like the content
Mm.
uses verbs differently.
Mhm.
The content doesn't tell a story the same way that Josephus is known to tell stories, even in the surrounding passages. Of course, there's the argument that there was actually an earlier, like a core to it that is genuinely Josephan. Uh, but the problem with that is that it's just pure speculation. Like there's no evidence that an earlier version existed. Some people say that there's a Syriac and Arabic version that represents the earlier version, but in reality, Alice Wheely has traced that back through like a chain of custody that shows that it all originates from our current extant version of it, which comes from Eusebius.
Mm.
And so there's no other version than the one that we currently have, which has all of the very Christianized portions in it. And just speculating about taking out the uncomfortable portions really isn't that great of an argument if you're looking to say that Josephus referenced to Jesus. Now, another problem with it is that it sounds a lot like what a third or fourth century Christian would be writing about it. And it's actually, the entire story is modeled off of the Emmaus Road story in Luke's gospel. um, all of that textual analysis kind of aside, if you look at the passage and where it's placed in Josephus's work, it interrupts like a flow of story that's being told. In the previous section, it talks about how Pilate was trying to interrupt like a protest by the Jews. They had a problem with some kind of water deal that was going on, and he talks about how he had his men dress up as the protesters, get into the crowd, and then like attack them. And
Mhm.
then the passage directly after the Testimonium Flavianum, it actually references that previous passage before the Testimonium Flavianum, because in the passage just after the Testimonium, it says, and another sad calamity befell the Jews, or something like that. I mean, why would it say that if, like, why would it say that if the Testimonium Flavianum was actually there? Like if they're in whatever form you want to present it in, the crucifixion of Jesus or the death of Jesus or whatnot wouldn't have been a sad calamity for the Jews. The Jews were the ones that were getting Jesus killed, right? They were the
Mhm.
ones that wanted. So that's not a sad calamity that befell the Jews. It would have been a sad calamity that befell the Christians. But so it makes a lot more sense if you take out that passage, which is actually one of the methods that you would use to determine whether or not there was an interpolation or some kind of tampering with a particular passage, like something's been inserted. If you take it out, just the part that you think is been tampered with, and the rest of it flows seamlessly, then that's more of an indication that something was tampered with. So if you do that with the entire Testimonium Flavianum, you'll find that the previous passage flows nicely into the passage just after it. So it seems to me like it probably wasn't there. And all the scholarships, all the critical scholarships surrounding this particular passage has only ever pointed in the direction of it not being written by Josephus. There are biblical scholars that, of course, say that, oh, well, there was an original passage there, or, they tried to defend it. But all of the arguments I find personally are just pretty weak.
Okay. I've heard Bart Ehrman defend it.
Mhm.
He believes that is historical evidence of Jesus. What do you know what the basis is for his acceptance of it, and why do you not accept his position?
Well, the reason why I don't accept his position is because he just speculates about it.
Okay.
He speculates that there was an earlier version of it without any kind of evidence to suggest that there was an earlier version of it.
Mhm.
Like I said before, some people, and I don't know if Bart does this, but some people bring up um, the Syriac and Aramaic versions of it, but those again are only ever traced back to Eusebius, which and that's the only extant version we have, which has all of the very highly Christianized phrases and everything in there. So it, I'm just very hesitant to go off of just pure speculation about it. And I haven't actually looked at Bart Ehrman's full and complete position, but
Mhm.
from what I remember of it, he just goes off of the speculation that there was some kind of historical core to it. Now, what Bart is very good at is parroting the biblical Christian majority opinion on things. Like the consensus is what he's good at parroting, and that's because Bart is not technically a historian. He's actually just a textual critic, and
Mm,
so
okay.
that's why like his books on like forgery and counter forgery or some of the other things uh that's why he's got great material on those particular topics, because those topics are about textual criticism. Like for instance, I accept Bart Ehrman's position on the pastoral epistles. That would be Titus, and there's three others. I can't remember them right now, but Titus is one of them, and then there's a couple others that they're tied together. But anyways, um, those particular epistles are not written by Paul, and that's Bart's position on it as well. And he does a really good job of explaining the textual differences between those books, and shows how they were just simply not written by Paul. They were written by somebody else impersonating Paul. And so I'm fine accepting that position because he actually has evidence to support his position. But on this particular position of the Testimonium Flavianum, he really doesn't have a good he doesn't really have good evidence to suggest his conclusion.
Okay. Okay. Um, I can understand Bart Ehrman's position because I have a tendency to do the same thing. Is he was a Christian pastor, but well, I don't know if he ever was a pastor, but he certainly was raised in the Christian belief, and it wasn't until he started really studying it and thinking about it that he came to stop believing. And I think a lot of his study is what took him there. But it's kind of a default that you turn to when you don't have anything else. And I found myself doing this in a number of ways. Like um when I make an argument in the absence of knowledge, I have a tendency to turn back to some of my old believer way of thinking about things.
Mhm.
And that could be what he's doing with the mythicist position.
Well, so like I said, Bart Ehrman this is his job, right?
Hmm.
And that's very concerning in this particular field, because a majority of the biblical scholars, New Testament scholars, um, they are contractually bound by statements of faith due to where they're working at. Now, I don't think that Bart is necessarily, but it's very evident that the Christian majority has a stronghold on this particular area of academia. And I can cite several examples, like, for instance, the Thomas Thompson. He was part of establishing the ahistoricity of the patriarchs.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and that's mainstream consensus
Hmm.
right now. And so, um, uh, he got blacklisted from the community.
Mm,
Like he
mhm.
he as an academic, he got his PhD. He went through school and everything like that, um, and he got his PhD, but he couldn't use it because he was blacklisted by the Christian academia.
Mm.
And so he ended up having to be like a house painter and a high school teacher and all this other stuff because he simply couldn't get work. And it's because he took the quote unquote radical position that the patriarchs of the Old Testament were not historical. Um, there's that. There's Mike Licona, who just
Mhm.
suggested that the zombie walk that happens in Matthew, I believe it is,
I thought it was
was,
John.
huh?
I thought it was John, but I could be wrong.
I think the zombie walk is it's either Matthew or Luke, and I think that it might be Matthew. Anyways, it's in one of the Gospels. The zombie walk, according to Mike Licona, is more about some kind of like end times prophetic imagery is what it's supposed to be, according to Mike. Now, because he took this position, Mike lost speaking engagements. He lost positions in academia. He lost a lot of a lot of foothold in the academic community of Christians. And these are just two examples of how this Christian majority tries to control the academic, side of Christianity. And I mean, if you don't go along with the consensus in academia as far as the Christian majority goes, they have the ability to totally blacklist you so that you cannot even use your PhD in the community. You become unemployable. So I think that there's plenty of reasons to doubt
Mhm.
whether or not
Mhm.
a person can be trusted. Now, I know Leo in the side chat kind of going a little crazy with the New Testament scholarship, right? But
Mhm.
the problem that I have with New Testament scholarship is that every time I find somebody that is arguing for the historicity of Jesus, most of the time, I find that they are working for an institution that has a statement of faith that requires their staff to adhere to in order to be employed there. Mike Lacona is part of that. Gary Habermas is part of that. Let's see, who else have I done? The most recent, Dr. Craig Evans. He's controlled by a statement of faith. These people,
Dr. William Lane Craig.
William Lane Craig would be controlled by a statement of faith too. I mean, a lot of these people, they have to take the position of historicity. They cannot consider even they. That's why you have so many apologists out there that say that it's just a ridiculous thing to even consider because they can't consider it.
Yeah, that leads me, and this is going to take us off on a little tangent, so I'll bring us back in a minute. But it's something I've been thinking a great deal about recently, and I don't really know the answer to this, and maybe you do or maybe you don't, because this is a little outside of your field as well. But with all of the former pastors that I have talked to, and so many of them saying, when I went to seminary and I learned this and this and this about the Bible, I couldn't believe it anymore. I have to wonder how many pastors are in pulpits preaching things that they don't really believe
Mhm.
because they're never going to admit that they don't really believe it. They're out of a job. They maybe they get 2 or 3 years into seminary and realize I don't believe any of this, but I've spent all this money on this education. Where else am I going to go now? And I have to wonder how many of them really believe what they preach.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's an entire group that's dedicated to helping those particular individuals. It's called the
Mm,
Clergy Project.
okay, I
Uh,
wasn't aware of that.
yeah, so I mean, there's a pretty substantial community of clergy out there that uh, don't believe what they're preaching, but that's the only thing that they're trained for. That's
Mhm,
the only thing they can
mhm.
do. That's the only way that they can pay their bills. So that's what they um, that's what that's what they do. They preach the message from the gospel, or from the Bible rather, but they try to just focus on like the meaningful aspects of it, things that they don't think are, all that detrimental to their parishioners. So,
Mhm.
I mean, there's a substantial community of those individuals.
Interesting. I recently ran into a channel called Evangelical-ish, and some of their beliefs were kind of interesting because they are ex-evangelicals, but they're still believers, but they've turned away from most of what makes an evangelical, and so they're I would put them more in the class of similar to Unitarians.
Hmm.
Let everyone believe whatever they want to believe. But they definitely still hold to a God belief. And so that was kind of interesting. And that seems like a kind of place where a preacher that no longer believes could end up.
Hmm.
Getting back to what you were talking about earlier with Josephus, do we have any original manuscripts of Josephus or fragments?
Well, I mean, we don't have any original manuscripts of it, but that's not exactly what we would need. The
Right,
early the
right.
the extant version of Josephus that we have comes from the third century with Eusebius,
Hmm.
and even then I think that's like our actually oldest physical manuscript maybe comes from the 10th century, maybe something like that. But I mean, honestly, I'm not really concerned with how old how old the physical manuscripts are. The fact is that we can trace this particular extant version
Hmm.
back to Eusebius in the third century. That's the important part.
Yeah, I'm not so much concerned about the age of the manuscript as when you have original manuscripts, it's much easier to establish that something wasn't added or changed later. When you have the
Mhm.
original to compare it to. But I realize that with literature of i- that time period, there is almost nothing, if anything, in existence.
Yeah. Well, and here's good. I'm glad that you brought this up, because here's something very important is that Origin, he wrote a document called Contra Celsum, against Celsus, because Celsus wrote a scathing like criticism of Christianity. And about a century later, Origin decided to pick it up and be like, I'm going to totally wreck this fool, right? And so what Origen did was he scoured through the historical records, including Josephus. He even pulls from Josephus on a number of occasions, and he does not mention the Testimonium Flavianum whatsoever. If it existed there, even in its redacted version, where it sounds something like what Josephus might write, um, that is not mentioned at all by Origen. But
Hmm.
the same library is then a couple of a couple of 100 years later, is inherited by Eusebius, the same library of books. And all of a sudden, Eusebius starts using the Testimonium Flavianum to defend Christianity. So it makes it seem a little suspicious there, with Origen specifically using Josephus to defend Christianity and not using the Testimonium Flavianum. And then Eusebius is like, aha, here is a passage that is a glowing review of Jesus from Josephus, you know? So
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
that, to me, that says that either Eusebius or his predecessor was the one that worked it into Josephus as a way to fabricate information about Jesus, which is not all that unheard of in Christian authorship. You've got like the several different books in the Bible that were definitely forged in the name of other people, like First Peter, Second Peter, written by two different people. You've got several other books in the canon that are written are claimed to have been written by somebody, and but later we figured out that they didn't actually write those books. And then you've got like the Gospel of Mark, who has an entire ending tacked on to it, and we don't know
Yeah.
which ending is there. So
Hmm.
the fact that Christians would have tampered with um, historical records is not all that out of the realm of possibility, and it's actually
Hmm.
highly probable, especially when you consider all the other secular histories that are expertly cut out right around the time when Jesus would have been mentioned. We have several books of histories written by historians where the time period surrounding Jesus is the only part that's missing.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, that is one of the reasons why I have never believed that there was I shouldn't say have never believed, but one of the reasons I no longer believe in a historical resurrection is, with an event that is supposed to have been the greatest event in all of human history, and yet somehow not a single contemporary historian seems to have noticed that it happened. That seems rather suspect.
Hmm.
From the mythicist position, then, how do you think Christianity started? Do you think that the writings of Paul started Christianity?
Well, no,
Okay.
because Paul mentions how there were Christians before him. So, and I
Okay.
mean, he was persecuting Christians. So,
Mhm.
I mean, I think that Christianity definitely started before Paul became a Christian, but the only indication that we get from the evidence that we have is a celestial version of this Jesus. Paul in Galatians 1:11 strictly says that he did not get his information from any person on earth, and he only
Right.
got it from a celestial Jesus.
Mhm.
And he rejects any kind of notion that he got any of his information from a human source. So, um, uh, how I think that it probably started is that there were Jews in the first century, or probably the latter parts of the first century BCE, that were starting to reinterpret scriptures, and they were trying to understand it to get messianic prophecies, or to know things about the Messiah that is to come. And we see evidence of this in in Philo of Alexandria. He reinterprets scriptures to be more messianic than they were originally meant to be, and he even describes the logos. Philo of Alexandria's logos is described by Philo in the exact same ways that Paul describes Jesus, and
Mm.
so uh,
Interesting.
yeah, and so Philo is only ever reading the scriptures to know anything about this archangel Messiah, and so I think that they were reinterpreting Old Testament scriptures to be more messianic, and in doing that, you eventually get people like Peter, who were the first to have hallucinations of this Jesus, and they had these hallucinations that they thought was a celestial Jesus revealing the gospel and revealing the information to them. And
Mm.
they were the original ones that kind of started this belief, but it was kind of building because they had these weird understandings of the Old Testament scriptures and when things were supposed to happen. And it just so happens that the way that they interpret some of the stuff in Daniel and in Isaiah, it eventually ends up with right around the 30s or so being
Mhm.
the time frame in which this Messiah was supposed to reveal himself. And
Mm.
so what it seems to me is that these people were expecting Messiah to come, and then they started having hallucinations, either because they were schizotypals, or for whatever reason they were having these hallucinations. Uh, they started believing that the Messiah had already come, that he had already died for their sins, and that he had done this in a celestial realm. And where we kind of get this idea that all of this happened in the celestial realm comes from a couple of different places. In the Ascension of Isaiah, we know that is a first century Christian book that talks about um, how this prophet Isaiah was taken up through the multiple levels of heaven, and he saw Jesus shedding his like godly status and coming down to the first layer of heaven, which would be right on top of the firmament, because in the Old Testament you had this cosmology of there being multiple different layers of heaven, and there's this solid firmament that sits on top of the earth, and that's part of the celestial realm. And so Jesus descended onto this firmament where Satan and his demons ruled over the earth, and they crucified and killed him, and then Jesus resurrected and went back up into the higher
Celestial.
parts of heaven. Well,
Mhm.
the more celestial parts, I guess, like the higher levels of heaven,
Okay.
sat at the right hand of God. And so that's one piece of evidence that shows that there was this early Christian understanding of Jesus descending to a celestial plane, dying and rising for the to absolve the sins of everybody. There's that, and then you also have the book of Hebrews, which was not written by Paul, but was written around the same time as Paul. So this is reflective of these early Jewish Christian beliefs. In the book of Hebrews, it actually specifically states that the there are copies, perfect copies of things that appear on earth in heaven. And so we're talking like rituals, we're talking buildings, we're talking copies of things that go on earth also being in this lower part of heaven that's controlled by Satan and his demons. And so uh, we have that, and then we've also got Paul, where he says that Satan is the ruler of this world, and that Jesus was killed or crucified by the rulers of this age. A lot of people like to say that, oh well, that's the Romans, right? That's him
Mhm.
referencing the Romans, but it's really vague. Like if you were going to reference the Romans, you would just say, "Oh, the Romans killed him," right? Or in whatever way that would be, it would be a direct reference to Romans. But he chose this very peculiar phrase called archons of this aeon, or rulers of this age. And in other portions of Paul's work, when he references Satan as being the ruler of this world. And so it's very similar phrasing, and we know that rulers of this age is used in early Jewish Christian writings to reference Satan and his demons. So like I said, when we started this, all of the evidence surrounding, when you take it into its full context, to me, it seems to point towards a celestial Jesus being crucified by Satan and his demons in the lower parts of heaven, versus a historical thing that happened. And I don't think that there's any verse in Paul's writings that specifically states that he existed here on earth and he was crucified by the Romans.
Okay. There is the Nicene Creed, which is in Corinthians, if I have it correctly.
Oh,
I
you
could
mean
be
the
wrong on that.
Pauline Creed?
Yes. Well, all right. Let's see. I'm trying to think. The earliest creed that's recorded in writing is in one of Paul's letters, and I believe is
Yeah,
that the Pauline Creed?
yeah, it
But
is.
okay,
It's
and that does refer to Jesus as being born of a woman, born. But that's a
Well,
creed that he heard, not him writing about something that he was told of or observed
well,
or
so
anything.
that's mixing a couple of different scriptures
Okay.
there.
Okay.
So 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 is the Pauline Creed. And
Mhm.
in fact, whenever Paul mentions something happening to Jesus or about Jesus, he actually says that it's just according to the scriptures. So, like,
Mm,
Jesus died and he was buried according to the
the
scriptures.
scriptures. Okay.
Uh, and then the part that references being born of a woman is actually Galatians 4:4, which has been shown to be part of a larger allegory. And Paul even says it himself later on in Galatians 4 that this is all an allegory, that this born of a woman is meant to highlight how Jesus provides us with eternal life. That
Mm,
because I do believe that Paul thought Jesus to be, a fleshly person, right?
okay.
He had Davidic flesh and Davidic blood, but it's just that he only ever came down to like the lower parts of heaven, and the way that Paul describes Jesus's body is the same way that he describes our future resurrection bodies. That those are bodies that are specifically crafted by God for us after we ourselves are resurrected like Jesus was. And so I think that Paul thought that he had a fleshly body. So when he talks about Jesus being born under the law, he's not talking about a literal birth here on earth. And this is because this is all an allegory. He's talking about being born. He references Abraham and with Hagar and Sarah, right? Being born under Hagar, being born under the law, meant that he was bound by this Jewish law. And then when he dies and resurrects, that's another birth of being born under Sarah, or being born in this spiritual cleanliness kind of thing. And so that's what that entire allegory is about. And the allegory starts in late in chapter 3 of Galatians, and then it continues on through chapter 4. And so you got to take, like, just plucking that one little thing out is quote mining,
Mhm.
and saying that, oh, that proves that he believed that he was born of a woman. Well, I mean, it's, for one thing, it's vague, and another thing, you're ripping it out of its context. And all the time I hear apologists that are telling me that I got to take shit into context. I gotta,
Mhm.
I gotta look at verses in context. Well, the context of this verse is an allegory, so he's not actually talking about a physical historical woman. And it would also be totally antithetical to Paul's position for him to even reference like a earthly birth for Jesus, because he specifically states that he got none of his information from a human source. He didn't know Jesus while he walked on earth. He only knew of a resurrected celestial Jesus. So I don't understand how Paul could have not gotten his information from an earthly source and only from a celestial source, and be able to reference a human, an earthly birth for Jesus. Like, there's something there that doesn't connect for me.
Mhm.
And it seems like it's a very illogical stuff, thing to say. So it's either Paul is lying about being born under a woman, or in my opinion, he's talking about an allegory the entire time, or he's lying about where he got his information from. And I don't see it being all that profitable to start trying to discern when Paul is lying or when he's telling the truth. And so I feel like you just got to take, Paul not at his word necessarily, but you only have what Paul has written down. And what Paul has written down is that he didn't get his information from any person. There was no historical connection between Paul and Jesus, or Paul's knowledge of Jesus. And then, with Paul not knowing Jesus, in while he was quote unquote alive and only knowing a celestial version, it doesn't make a lot of sense for him to be talking about a historical, like, earthly birth for Jesus there.
Okay. Leophilius argues, yes, it does. It says he was born under a Roman emperor and was born of a flesh and blood woman, was born under the law of man. The celestial Jesus idea is not reflected in academia. Now,
Well,
my
you know,
first, let me ask this real quick
right.
because this is going to be really easy to answer. When he says that it says he was born under a Roman Empire, that can only refer to the Gospels, correct? As there is no writing about Jesus being born under a particular emperor other than in two of the Gospels. Or am I wrong on
Yeah.
that point?
Well, I mean, I'm not exactly sure which passage Leo is mentioning here. I don't
Okay.
know if maybe he can put the passage in there, but so the part that he's saying right here, I'm going to read from Galatians 4 for y'all. It says, "What I am saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time is set by his father. So also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the spirit of his son into our hearts, the spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, has God made you also an heir." So I don't know where Leo is getting the idea that Paul mentions a specific emperor or like a Roman emperor that he was born under or anything like that. The celestial Jesus is most definitely reflected in academia, even by Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman has come around to the position that the early Christians believed in a celestial Jesus that pre-existed Christianity. You have the most explicit version of this in the Gospel of John, which is a second century document. So even on into the second century, do you have Christians believing in a pre-existent, Son of God that became flesh? Whenever, if you look at the Greek, whenever, like even right here in Galatians 4:4, when he says that he was quote unquote born of a woman, the actual Greek word used there is actually used for manufacture or being made, not for being born. This is, of course, I was reading the New International Version, but subsequent versions of this have forced interpretations of this word to mean like born of, when it really means made. And Paul has used this in various other places, like when talking about our future celestial bodies, like our future resurrection bodies. He uses the exact same word that they use for born of a woman here. So it seems to me like when you take Paul into full context with how he uses the words that he's using in other portions of his writings, it seems more like he's talking about the manufacture of a body. And right here again, it's allegory. Now, there are plenty of New Testament scholars, biblical scholars, that would say that this is not an allegory, but Paul says it directly later on in Galatians 4:4. He says in Galatians 4:21, I'll start reading. It says, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of the divine promise. These things are being taken figuratively. The women represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. And it says, for it is written, and he goes into like a prophetic thing where he references scriptures yet again for how he knows this. So I mean, that's right there explaining the two different women that are being born, or that Jesus was born under. You've got born under the law, which is Hagar, and then you've got spiritually reborn, which is Sarah.
We have a question here from Dustin Ellerby.
Okay.
He asks, what about the idea of there being copies of heavenly beings and earthly beings? I'm not sure what he's referencing there. Do you?
Well, it kind of, Dustin, it kind of sounds like you're talking about in Hebrews, where it talks about there being copies of things on earth and in heaven. And I mean, that's not talking about copies of people, kind of like Body Snatcher style. It's talking about like copies of temples, copies of places, copies of rituals. All those things are done in the lower parts of heaven. Because like on earth, they're imperfect versions of the copies that are in heaven. And that's what the whole like blood ceremonies and everything was about, was like to make up for the imperfections of the earthly versions of those physical things. So it's not that there are copies of people in heaven and on earth, sort of us style copies, but it's copies of physical places and things.
Which kind of leads into one of my favorite arguments, which I'm surprised I don't see more. And I'm not that bright. I know a lot of people think I am, but really what it is when I hear good arguments, I repeat them. But one that I kind of came up with on my own, and I don't understand why I don't hear it more, is if Jesus resurrected physically, where is the body? If Christians are so fond of saying that his tomb is empty, and so, well, fine, where is the body? Well, it's in heaven. Is heaven a physical place? No, it's a spiritual place. Can a physical thing exist in a place that isn't physical? No. Well, then how can a physical body exist in heaven? It doesn't. It's a spiritual body. Okay, if it's a spiritual body, now we're back to the original question. Where is Jesus' physical body?
Well, I mean, you got to understand how early Christians viewed the celestial realm. Because ripping that out, like ripping what their words out of how they viewed their own celestial planes or celestial existence, does a little bit of a disservice, because like I was saying with Paul, Paul considered the celestial realm to be a physical place that you can go to, just like hell, or Sheol in the Old Testament was a physical place that you could conceivably
we know
go
that
to.
that's not true. I mean, just from our own, because we can study the cosmos. Paul couldn't. He didn't have a telescope. He didn't know that,
Right.
that traveling to the stars was not a possible thing, and that there is no realm of heaven up in the clouds. We can go up in the clouds and look, and there's nobody there. So we know things that
Right.
Paul couldn't possibly know in his time period.
Well, right. I mean, that I feel like that just makes my point for me, because they couldn't do that, and they thought that there was a firmament covering the
Right,
earth.
right,
Right.
right. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
So I
wasn't
mean,
really
they
arguing with you. I was more just saying that,
okay.
I can see where they would have believed this in that time period,
Oh
but I
yeah.
don't understand why anyone would believe that now.
Oh,
Because
I don't either. I mean, it's totally baffling to me. Like, I
Mhm.
don't understand why the resurrection is like easier to believe for some people,
Mhm.
because it just totally escapes me, like
Mhm.
this idea of his resurrection or whatnot. So yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so let's see. What are some of the other ramifications that you think come from the mythicist position?
Other ramifications. I mean, I don't think that even if we were to figure out for 100% certain that Jesus didn't exist in history, I don't think that that has to affect like people's belief in Jesus or anything like that.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, you know, Paul and the early Christians, they didn't have a problem with the purely celestial Jesus, as we've seen in Paul's writings. So I don't think that you need a historical Jesus in order to, you know, have faith in you know, Jesus and his sacrifice or anything like that. I think that this idea that it is historical or it needs to have historically happened is just something that's kind of developed over time with, you know, the repetition of, you know, people believing that it was historical. And so as far as like the ramifications of it, I think that I don't think that mythicism will ever be like a mainstream position.
Mhm.
And that's due to the fact that the majority of people that are investigating like biblical history and New Testament like scholarship and stuff are Christians. And so it would be very difficult, I think, for Christian academics to go something that's completely antithetical to their dogma of, you know, the gospels being historical truth and everything like that. So I think that it will never be like a mainstream position, but I think that as time goes on, you know, we'll get more people that are doing more research into it, and I really don't think that Jesus can be not sacrificed, but I don't think that Jesus can be saved with the current evidence that we have. I think that we would need to discover new evidence. So I don't know if that's answer your question.
Yeah, it does, but it leads me to another question. I had always considered the mythicist position to be an atheist position. I'd never considered the possibility that one could be a Christian mythicist.
Mhm.
Um, that is a novel idea to me. And now that you explain it, that Paul essentially was a Christian mythicist. Yes, I see that you are right on that point. Is there a small sect today that you are aware of Christian mythicists?
Well, I mean, I don't think that there's a sect, but hold on, I gotta look up his name in my Crestus app real quick. But there is, or well, I don't know if he's passed away just yet, but there is one. Let's see, credible experts. Uh, believe it. Oh yes, Thomas Brody. He's a Christian and he's a mythicist. So, um, you know, he actually lost his job at a school that he founded
Mm,
because he stated that he didn't think that Jesus was a historical figure, but that didn't matter to him.
mhm,
You know, his ahistoricity, but he ended up losing his job because he didn't think, or you know, he didn't believe in a historical Jesus. And one minor correction I would say is that I don't think that Paul considered Jesus to be like myth, right?
m'kay. Well,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah, you're right, I overstepped there.
Oh no, you're fine.
Mhm,
I was just gonna specify that that you know, Paul and Peter and the early apostles and Christians, I think that they all wholly believed in Jesus as a celestial figure. I think they all wholly believed in the very basic, you know, gospel that even Paul recites, being that, you know, he's a you know, he died, was buried, and resurrected to absolve sins. I think that they completely believed in those things. I just think that there's a shift in where those things happened, from, you know, where they thought it happened and where we think it happened.
mm. We have another question from Dustin. If Jesus transformed and gave up his divinity to be like a human, do you think that makes the Trinity concept null?
Yeah, I mean, I think originally there was no real Trinity, at least in Christian
Hmm.
theology. I know that the Trinity developed later. That's a later development. Um, uh, See, as far as we know, like between Paul and Philo of Alexandria, this Messiah of Judaism was an archangel figure that you know died for sins and was there to save the Jewish people. And so with him being an archangel figure, he's still a celestial being, but I think that he's different from God. And this is even reflected in the Gospel of Mark, because I don't know if you know this, but the Gospel of Mark is an adoptionist gospel. That's why in the Gospel of Mark he starts off with Jesus being baptized, because and
Yes, yes.
this is in scholarship, like mainstream scholarship, of when Jesus is baptized in the River Jordan and he's pulled out. Before like anything really happens, the archangel figure embodied by a dove, generally is how it's envisioned, actually swoops down and sort of inhabits this body of a man, and then sort of skin walks around with him until his death, when the archangel figure escapes that body and goes back up into heaven. This is indicative of an adoptionist type of theology there, being that this Jesus figure. That's why this is why the birth didn't really matter in Mark's gospel, is because this archangel figure just
Mm.
inhabited the body of Jesus and
Hmm.
used it to accomplish what he needed to on earth, and then went back up into heaven. The archangel figure did so. And this is pretty similar to how the old Jewish kings were adopted into the family of God. The exact
Hmm.
same thing happens here. This Jesus person was adopted as the son of God at his baptism, and so he wasn't the son of God prior to the baptism, but then he was adopted into it.
You are my
So
beloved son. Today I have begotten you.
yeah.
Yeah, I was looking that up the other day because someone was making this. Maybe it was you. I get confused as to where I've seen things recently. And I was surprised that, yeah, I thought that was in one of the Gospels and it wasn't. It was in a couple of the other books. In fact, it was in the Old Testament books. But nevertheless, Christians always point to that as being what was said at the baptism. There was a comment from Junk Shop that I wanted to highlight. Let me see if I can find it again. Oh, I should have. There it is. I think you've got a convert.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good point, and it's honestly why I never really cared much about the mythicism question. My concern is the harm the belief does, not how much DNA evidence the belief is based on.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I so this is an incredibly niche topic area,
Hmm.
right? Like, I don't expect a lot of people to be all that interested in it. I'm interested in it because um, uh, I'm interested in it because I'm interested in history and
Good.
like the historical nature of Christianity, and like what actually happened like at the very beginning of Christianity. That's what intrigues me. But
Okay.
I highly suggest against pulling this out in just normal conversations, either with a Christian or with atheists in general. Like, I don't think that mythicism should be like something in your back pocket that you throw out for why you don't believe in Jesus or believe in God or
Hmm.
something like that.
Hmm.
I don't think that people should try to persuade a Christian against the historical Jesus. I think that I think that uh, you know this topic area should only come up if somebody else wants to talk about this topic in particular. Like, if someone's wanting to try to say that, oh, the Bible's based on history or the Gospels are based on history. Well, I mean, you can assume that Jesus existed And that still doesn't mean that the gospels represent history in any kind of fashion.
Mhm.
You can still argue about that, but it's when you get into the very specific area of like, well, we have evidence for Jesus, or Paul specifically says that he got his information from eyewitnesses, and so
Yeah.
therefore this stuff is all based on eyewitness testimony and stuff like that. I In that particular situation, definitely pull out the mythicist card, and you can argue against all of that. But unless the person is wanting to have that particular conversation, then I would suggest definitely not like covering it or pulling it out or mentioning it to somebody, because ultimately it really doesn't matter.
Mhm.
As far as the belief goes, the belief can still be harmful even if Jesus was a myth. And
Mhm.
we see that day in day out with how Christianity is implemented, especially here in the United States. But I think that the harm that Christianity can be used for is far more important than whether or not like Jesus was historical.
The reason I was kind of excited when you said you're really into history, and again, we're gonna end up going off topic a little bit, and this might be a little out of your bailiwick because this goes to Old Testament history rather than
Mhm.
Christian, specific New Testament history. But one of the historical facts that really was the death knell of my faith was when Aaron Ra said the flood did not happen, and he mentioned the history of it. And that was a light bulb moment for me. And it was a
Mhm.
light bulb moment for me because not only did I know he was right, I knew that I had always known that and I had just never put it together before. And yet I very rarely see anyone other than Aaron Ra making this argument that if there was a global flood, not only would the human race have to have been completely eradicated from the earth, it would have had to have remained humanless except for one small city for 100 years. Because according to the biblical narrative, humans remained in that one spot and they built the Tower of Babel. And it was because they failed to heed the command of God to spread out and multiply that God confused their languages and caused them to spread out and multiply. And yet, anytime you take a course in ancient human history, you never hear the professor say, okay, and then there was this 100-year gap where civilization vanished and this people group restarted over this, over here 100 years later, and they eventually rebuilt the civilization. You don't hear that in any ancient history course. So how can they hold so strongly to the belief that earth was devoid of the human race for 100 years when there's just no evidence of that?
Right. And I mean, you would be hard pressed to try to, find an area of the earth that didn't show some kind of human habitation,
Right, exactly.
when the flood was supposedly happening. I've actually got a video that's coming out tomorrow, where a guy uses the argument of, well, many cultures have these flood myths, so it probably, like, the global flood probably happened because all these other cultures also record a giant flood. And
Mhm.
the thing that gets me about that is that, like, when God flooded the earth, he killed everybody. Like, nearly immediately, he flooded the entire earth. Who was there in those particular cultures to write down about this flood? Like, after everything subsided, like a year after the flood happened or whatever, like, there would have been such a long period of time that even if they did repopulate the earth, which wouldn't be possible biologically, um even if they did, that would still mean that all these cultures, like the Aztec culture that has a flood myth in their beliefs,
Hmm.
like that would have been Noah's people. Well, I just I don't
Yeah, I
I don't
hadn't I
see.
hadn't thought about that. That yeah, their flood myth should have been their flood story should have been here comes the flood, and that was the end of the people group.
Right.
Yeah, I
But
hadn't thought about that. That's interesting.
there would have been nobody left around to like write about like the flood, what happened afterwards, or what caused the flood, or anything like that.
Hmm. Yeah, all these people would have all these records we have would have to all be post flood records. And have to be written by people who dispersed after the Tower of Babel. Another comment from Junk Shop. As an intellectual pursuit, I absolutely get it. I watch the mythicist content when it appears, but I never see it used as anything but a bludgeoning tool. Good for you, John, for the record.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like I said, it's a very niche kind of topic area, and I don't think that anybody should like, whip it out to bludgeon anybody like in a discussion or a debate, like unless the person's actually wanting to talk about the historical references to Jesus, then I really don't think that it's necessary for it to come up. I mean, we're already having a tough time trying to reach people on some of the most basic levels, as far as like reasonable, rational, thinking and conclusions. And I think that, throwing in, well, Jesus didn't exist is like, throwing a wrench into whatever you got going, and it's just going to derail it.
TA 13S says a global flood would have destroyed all the topsoil and made it impossible for plants to grow. Yet the Bible says there was an olive tree right after, before the waters even fully receded. A date tree I could buy. Because when I was in Israel, that was one of the points they made was that the date trees are the only trees that grow near the Sea of Galilee because they're one of very few plants that can survive on salt water. Now they
Mhm.
can't survive in the water that's as salinous as the Sea of Galilee, but they can withstand a certain amount of salt in their water.
Yeah. In my own, like, I guess, research into the ramifications of all the different flood ideas, like how it happened and everything like that, in order for like, because there's the idea that water came from up underneath the crust of the earth to fill the earth with, or to flood the earth with. But the problem is that in order for that water to be shot out from underneath the crust, it would actually be going so fast that it would, when it escaped the crust, it would actually be steam, and that would cause the entire face of the earth to be like scorched, for one. For two, I think that it would have probably blown the planet up, because the amount of energy needed to eject all of that water would cause
Mhm.
the entire earth to just blow up.
That was something that I first got from Erica Gutsick Gibbon, the heat problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I have discovered since then that anytime I bring up the heat problem in an argument, that tends to be the last I see of the person I'm arguing with. Now, granted, I'm talking about Twitter arguments, and I've
Mm-hmm.
I've mentioned this to other people that I use Twitter as a sounding board. Sometimes I have made some stupid arguments on Twitter, and I love the fact that I can make a stupid argument on Twitter and it's there today and it's gone tomorrow and everyone's forgotten about it. And I kind of use that as a sounding board to shape what's going to fly and what's not going to fly in something more serious, a more serious conversation. And yeah, every time I bring up the heat problem with someone on Twitter, I never see them again.
I mean, it's a difficult problem to overcome. And my guess is that most people wouldn't really know how to argue like against it, because I mean they don't know how to calculate how much heat would be generated by all that water being shot up from, like, I think the current idea is like 10 kilometers below the crust of the earth. Um, like they wouldn't even begin to know how to calculate that.
Theo says that's how the Chinese learned to flood their rice fields.
Yep, I'm sure it is.
uh, let's see if I've missed anything else that we need to bring up. Someday we're going to find some kind of microscopic plankton anglerfish ecosystem down in the silt of the Dead Sea, and scientists are all going to experience spontaneous publication. And TA says it would have made the entire surface to be molten for a long time. The water vapor released would have kept it that way due to greenhouse effect.
Yeah.
That's a good point, especially since the creationists say that there was this mist that covered the earth prior to the flood, and that's why it never rained prior to the flood, because there was this mist. And yeah, that would have included something like what you're describing there. And Purple says Kent Hovind claims that the flood was caused by the continents to move their current positions. Yeah, I think even AIG claims that that's part of it. The continents were racing around from the Pangea to their current positions, but that's also part of the heat problem, because those racing continents would generate even more heat.
Well, yeah, not only that, but like the continents, moving that fast and whatnot. I mean, it would have been, it would have been hell for the plate tectonics. With the continents careening everywhere. I don't think that it could actually move that fast.
I made that argument to someone on Twitter, and the response was, well, we've got. Oh, I think I just junk shopped a bit. Are you familiar with that term?
No, I'm assuming that it references junk shop.
Yeah, Junk Shop Library is notorious for having technical issues and internet issues. And MathPig even had that added to the Urban Dictionary, the term junk shopping, which refers to what your internet glitching. But anyway, I lost my train of thought. We were talking about the Pangea and the racing of the continents, and yeah, this person was saying, well, if God could have protected the people by building them a boat, he could have protected the boat. And I said, if he's going to put the boat in a bubble to protect it, why not just put the people in a bubble and forget about the stupid boat? Give the animals their personal bubbles.
Yeah, that would have been much easier, but God never does anything easy in the Bible.
Well, or better yet, just a massive heart attack for all the evil people, and then you don't have to worry about protecting all the animals and the plants.
You don't have to worry about a flood. I mean, there's so many different ways that it could have been better executed.
Yep. And Junk Shop says, and as such, am I immortal? Okay, I think that kind of wraps it up, and I really appreciate you coming and talking about this. This was very interesting. I learned a great deal today, and I think we got a really good discussion from the chat as well. But before we close up, John, I want to give you an opportunity to once again tell people what you've got coming up, primarily because there are 30 people watching right now, and when you said it the first time, there were only 7, so most of the people weren't here.
Okay. All right. Well, I do want to start off by saying that I'm perfectly fine with people, not agreeing with me on the mythicist position. We can have friendly dialogues and not agree with each other. I'm not going to block you or anything like that just because we disagree. That's in this particular conversation, it gets heated kind of quick sometimes. And so I just want to put that out there that I'm not going to sit here and cut people out just because they disagree with me. But just to let you guys know, I'm here on YouTube as Godless Engineer, and I've also got another channel that I've been uploading to, also called Godless Engineer Shorts, where I've got pieces of my content put up there in easier to digest portions, and not the big long ones that we've been having here lately. So if you want to go and subscribe there, I've got some great stuff. Let's see, tomorrow we've got a Christian apologist from TikTok who's going to be suggesting that the flood created fossils. And so that's going to be an interesting video. And then Friday night, we've got our live stream, which is actually going to be Richard Carrier coming on my channel to
Oh,
discuss
cool.
mythicism.
So
Yeah.
cool. What time on
Yeah.
Friday?
It's going to be at 6 p.m. Central Time.
Okay, very
So
good. Okay.
yeah, it's going to be kind of an early one on Friday, but I'm going to have like Carrier for as long as we have questions, I guess.
Okay.
So I've got that, and then next week we've got a video about the devil's secrets, and then I've got to record a video for next Thursday. So I don't know what that's going to be just yet, but I'll definitely get something out. And then Junie in the chat there's asking if I'm still doing the Godless Engineer gaming. I do on occasion. I haven't been lately just because I've been trying to get like in a good position with getting my editing done, and I've kind of drug my feet this week about it, but I'm getting to a good position on it so I can start doing the game streaming again over on GE Plays. So but yeah, we got a lot of great stuff coming out on the channel this next week, so I hope that you guys will join me over there if you're not already subscribed.
And Junk Shop says shorts. I think it's too cold for shorts right now.
Hey, I'm wearing sweatpants right now, and that's pretty much that's how I exist in this world currently.
And TA asks, is that like Victoria's Secret?
Like what, the GE shorts?
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah.
I think Junk Shop is asking for a Josephus
Hashtag Josephus. Yeah. Oh man, Josephus has been a really great addition to the regular stuff.
I like Josephus too. Okay, coming up on my channel, I have two major celebrities in a row. Following Godless Engineer, next week I have Jim Barrows. And this is a first time for me. I have never done anything with Jim Barrows before, and so that is going to be a lot of fun. I've been trying to come up with a topic for him, and I haven't asked him yet, so don't hold me to this. It might not be something he wants to do, but I really think that he's going to like what I came up with just like 10 minutes before we went on the air, which is I'm going to ask him to collect some of the dumbest questions he's been asked on live shows, and we'll talk about dumb questions.
I'm sure that'll be hilarious.
I think it will be too. I would think it will be too. For produced videos this week, I started a project and ended up scrapping it because it was kind of boring. And then I started another one, and this one turned much more serious than most of what I do because I found a video with someone that was, a question that atheists can't ask, which is usually some apologist asking some dumb question. And this one was not. This was a legitimate apologist who was steel manning the atheist position and asking a very legitimate question. And so I put together a very serious video. And the one thing I'm kind of struggling with, I just shot that before we went live today. And my portion of it before I've edited is already 45 minutes. And I haven't even edited in the 15 minutes of his video that I need to add into it. So it's too long. And I wish I had someone on staff with me that could go through it and say, we really could cut out this part because that's so hard for me to do, especially after I've shot something. It's like, I've already done that. Do I really want to cut that out? But we'll see. But my video this week may be rather long, and it may be a little bit late because I started a little late because I scrapped that other project. So that's what's coming up on my channel. I want to thank everyone in the chat for coming. Your questions have been wonderful. Your comments have been wonderful. And it has been great seeing all of you here. And John, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I always appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on. It's been I always love talking about this topic. If people want to hear me rant about it for a bit, so I really appreciate it.
Okay, and with that, we'll say goodbye to everyone and live your life.